Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I see all the participants are being let in now. So in just a couple seconds, I'll start by introducing our guests today for this second panel of our annual conference. All right, so now that it's just after 4:30, we'll get right underway. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Weaver Lilly, and I'm the Vice President of the Buckley Program. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the second panel of our 2020 annual conference. Today's panel, entitled Woodstock, the Sexual Revolution and the Decay of American Social Order. After the election of Donald Trump in 2016, many on the right began to question previous assumptions about social issues in America. Perhaps, some argued, a new moral majority could form around economic nationalism and social and cultural conservatism. To build a new politics, however, some thinkers have looked to the past to see where we went wrong. Before I introduce our guests this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the Buckley Program. The William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale University. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2010. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and on how to become a fellow at our website, www.buckleyprogram.com. Now, on to today's guests. Christopher Caldwell is a contributing editor at the Claremont Review of Books and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He is the author, most recently, of The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. Helen Andrews is a senior editor at The American Conservative and author of the forthcoming book, Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster, which will be released this January. Previously, she was a managing editor of the Washington Examiner magazine and a 2017-2018 Robert Novak Journalism Fellow. From 2012 to 2017, she lived in Sydney, Australia, working as a think tank researcher for the Center for Independent Studies. Before that, she was an associate editor at National Review. Christine Rosen is a senior writer at Commentary Magazine and a chair of the Colloquy on Knowledge, Technology, and Culture at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. She is also a senior editor of The New Atlantis. Her books include Preaching Eugenics, Religious Leaders and the American Eugenics Movement, My Fundamentalist Education, and the Extinction of Experience. Her writing has appeared in publications such as the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New Republic, Democracy Journal, Prospect, Hedgehog Review, and the New England Journal of Medicine. She holds a PhD in history from Emory University, and she lives with her children in Washington, D.C. Mary Eberstadt is a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C., and author of the new book, Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. Her other books include It's Dangerous to Believe, How the West Really Lost God, and Adam and Eve After the Pill. Mrs. Eberstadt's writing has appeared in many magazines and journals, including Time, The Wall Street Journal, National Review, First Things, and The Weekly Standard. Her 2010 novel, The Loser Letters, about a young woman in rehab struggling with atheism, was adapted for stage and premiered at the Catholic University in fall of 2017. Seton Hall University awarded her an honorary doctorate in humane letters in 2014. During the Reagan administration, she was a speechwriter to Secretary of State George Shultz and a special assistant to Ambassador Jean J. Kirkpatrick at the United Nations. Her work can be found on her website, maryeberstadt.com. We'll begin by each guest giving a brief opening statement, followed by a couple questions from myself, and finally questions from the audience, which you can submit through Zoom's Q&A feature. So with that, please join me in warmly welcoming Christopher Caldwell, Helen Andrews, Christine Rosen, and Mary Eberstadt virtually to Yale and the William F. Buckley Program. Mr. Caldwell, you may begin with your opening statement.
Good. My opening statement would I gather from our program notes that what we're here to figure out is what the roots of the sexual revolution are, or the roots of that part of the 1960s, and whether they have, whether they are a descendant, or let's say, or whether they are an ancestor of some of the movements we have going on today, whether our culture is really descended from our political culture is descended from the sexual revolution. I tend, in a book I wrote recently, which I won't summarize because if you've read it, you won't need a summary. And if you haven't read it, I don't want it to substitute for the experience of reading the book. I tended to, I was very impressed with the treatment of the cultural 1960s, and particularly the sexual culture of the 1960s, that was given by a now forgotten book by a fellow named Philip Slater, who was a classicist at Brandeis University. And he, like a number of people in the 1960s, but in a very distinctive way, looked at the 60s as really two movements. There was a political movement, a movement of straightforward political leftism, let's say collaterally related to the old communist movements from before, that really sought political change. And then there was a cultural movement that had really separate origins, sort of something folky, something religious. I think it's out of the cultural movement that what we love most about the 1960s, basically folk music and marijuana, tends to come. But I'm not sure they have that much to do with one another. But it is the sexual revolution seems to overlap a little bit with both. I think the sexual revolution is something that's operating actually on a sort of third parallel track, which is a technological track. I think that it has more to do with the invention of a cheap and effective birth control pill that was brought to market in 1960. And I think that the sexual revolution is largely the adjustment of mores to the, let's say, the disattachment of sex and procreation. I mean, the reliable disattachment. The result seems to have happened in two stages, which maybe we can talk about later on today. I won't go about this too long. The first stage was what we think of as the sexual revolution, the free sex of the 1960s, the sexual liberation, it's called, the sort of sexual life that Janis Joplin lived. And the second stage of this is what Slater, in his book, calls the unchaperoned society. And this is the great paradox of the 1960s, which is when you no longer have the worry about getting pregnant and getting hooked up with the wrong person and things like that, an important barrier to excess in a young person's life disappears. So the young person must begin to build that barrier in his own mind. And one result that you get is a kind of a desexualization of the sort that you have now, where you have, women, the average number of births per woman falling well below replacement rate. And so you have this paradox of desexualization due to over-sexualization. That, I think, is a really central thing of our time. I'll leave it to the other speakers now.
Okay, Helen, you're up.
Great. Well, thank you, Weaver. As Weaver told you, I have a book coming out in January about the baby boomers and what their generation did to the world, which essentially argues that the boomers were responsible for a sundering of civilization on the scale of the Protestant Reformation. And the way of approaching that question that I kept coming back to as I wrote the book was simply to imagine a time traveler. If someone had fallen asleep in 1939 and woken up in 2020, what changes would he notice? What things would surprise him or shock him? And the advantage of that framing is that it sidesteps a lot of the superficial technological changes that a lot of people think of as being the most important difference between then and now. Because really, our time traveler is not going to be all that impressed by the iPhone in your pocket. On the contrary, he's going to say, yep, that seems about where I expected technology to be at this stage. In the same way that if you fell asleep and woke up in 80 years and saw flying cars, you wouldn't be shocked. You'd say, yep, that seems about right. Whereas if you woke up and found that cannibalism was okay now and you could get a human flesh burger at McDonald's, you would think that was really strange and you would want to know what had happened. So when we talk about the legacy of the 60s, those are the kinds of changes that it's important to focus on, the things that would surprise our time traveler. And I really encourage all of the people in the audience for this panel to go through that kind of thought experiment as we're having this discussion. Imagine yourselves walking down the streets of New Haven with somebody from 1939 and just answering his questions and explaining things to him. Because if you're able to kind of hear the mentality of someone from a pre-boomer world, you will find that the things that jump out at him are not necessarily what would occur to you and me. For example, the first thing that a time traveler from 1940 would notice walking down the streets of any city in America today is how shabbily everyone is dressed. The sight of grown men wearing sneakers, or white collar workers wearing jeans to the office, or housewives taking their kids to the park in yoga pants and a baggy t-shirt, these would all astonish somebody. Because of course, if you look at a photograph from 1940, just any random street shot, you're gonna see that the women are wearing high heels and skirts, the men are wearing shirts that have buttons on them, nobody's clothes have a logo, and absolutely no one outside of the criminal classes has a tattoo. Another thing that our time traveler would notice would be that everybody seems to be on drugs. And I'm referring both to recreational drugs, because of course, before the 1960s, you would be highly unlikely to know anybody who even used marijuana unless you were a jazz musician or something. So the idea that there would be entire communities where everybody knows somebody who uses hard drugs would be shocking to our man from 1939. But I'm also referring to the rise of mind-altering drugs in the legal sense and psychiatric medication. The CDC's most recent numbers show that the proportion of Americans on antidepressants has now reached 1 in 6. And among white women, it's 1 in 4. And I think that would be genuinely shocking and possibly even dystopian to somebody from an earlier era. And it's important that we connect the rise of psychiatric medication to the legacy of the 1960s and the drug revolution in the kind of pot and cocaine sense, because it's just impossible to imagine the widespread use of mind-altering pills by ordinary people prescribed by doctors without that earlier recreational drug revolution. So I could continue just ticking off things that would weird out our time traveler. And if you want to know more, I urge you to buy the book I have coming out, because there's one on every page. But rather than do that, I'll close by making a general observation about the legacy of the 60s more broadly, using those two examples. And that observation is this. Most people think that the changes of the 1960s were all about liberation. Whether you think that was a good thing or a bad thing, most people agree the legacy of the 60s was about freeing the individual from external constraints. But I think that if you scratch the surface on a lot of these changes, you'll find that liberation was actually just a cover story a lot of the time. And consider the example of clothes, and more specifically clothes in the workplace. While I was writing the book, I did an informal poll of some baby boomers I know, asking about what they had noticed about workplace attire over the course of their careers. And they all agreed that the decline in standards of dress was absolutely a revolution. But one of them made what was to me a revelatory observation. This is a guy who worked at a law firm in New York City. And he said that the rise of casual wear in his office coincided exactly with the rise of the culture of workaholic, maximizing billable hours. That is, when he was just starting out, it was a much stuffier office in the sense that everybody had to wear a suit, but more relaxed in the sense that even the harshest partner respected quitting time, and it was understood that everybody should be allowed to go home, to be home in time for dinner. But eventually his firm got caught up in the culture that prevails now, where, if you're a young associate, you might as well give up on having a personal life for the first few years because your boss is going to be keeping you there till midnight on a regular basis. And it was then that employers started saying, well, if I'm going to keep you late, I can't expect you to wear an uncomfortable suit the whole time, for 18 hours. So you might as well wear something more comfortable. So far from being an example of liberating workers to wear things that express themselves more, the rise of casual wear was actually a sign that employers had taken over more of their employees' lives. And my final observation will be on drugs. I think a lot of the real significance of the drug revolution becomes more obvious when you think about it in terms of its chronology and how closely it maps on to the boomer life cycle. For example, it's not a coincidence that Adderall and ADD first became really popular and faddish at the time when boomers were having their young families. But you have to ask yourself, did the baby boomers decide, for the first time in human civilization, that they were going to pump their elementary school-aged kids full of amphetamines because they loved them so much? Or was it to make things easier for themselves? Was it something more selfish? Because boomer parents, as we know, are just allergic to the concept of discipline. And so they said to themselves, well, I don't want to be a disciplinarian like my parents. I want to be the cool dad or the cool mom. But in order to make it possible for me to do that, I need my kid to be a little more chilled out. So let's dope him up. So I think that Gen Z and the millennials, who are the first generations to kind of grow up in the shadow of the pharmaceutical revolution in terms of psychiatric drugs, are in a good position to see themselves not as protagonists in the drug revolution, but as victims of it. Because these prescriptions that people our age have now been growing up with, being diagnosed with, they start taking antidepressants when they're in high school and just keep on taking them throughout adulthood. That's something not that they sought out themselves, but that was done to them by their parents and their doctors. And so I think they are in a position to see, and a lot of the people the age of current Buckley Program participants are in a position to see that the drug revolution was not, as it was sold, about liberating the individual for self-exploration or to live their best life, but was really never about liberation in the first place. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Ms. Rosen.
Thank you, Weaver. I was actually really happy to see the word revolution in the panel, because maybe it's just the last 6 months or so here in the US, but there's been a lot of revolutionary fervor in the air. So it'll be fun to revisit the sexual revolution and what we think are some of its long tail effects. I think it's worth pointing out, first of all, that revolutions are extraordinarily efficient engines of destruction. And what they're not always so good at doing is rebuilding after that destruction. And I think the sexual revolution does offer a pretty good example of that. And as both Helen and Chris have already flagged, you can see already some of the sort of genie out of the bottle effects of the sexual revolution of the 60s down to this day. Courtship, which has gave way to hookup culture, which has given way to whatever we want to call today's dating market. It's more like a digital meat market, Tinder, online dating. I think we've seen discussions of sexual behavior, which were one of the obsessions of the 1960s era and sexual liberation, dwarfed in recent years by discussions of sexual identity, which is a distinct thing, which I think has also further eroded some of the public-private distinctions that, as a conservative, has always concerned me, thinking about the future. It's also raised, I think, a number of issues about how much more involved the state is in monitoring issues of sex and identity. The liberation of the 60s gave way to kind of a libertarianism for a while, and which I think we can now probably all agree has become a form of libertinism, for which we actually don't have a really good common language to challenge. And I think we are going to talk a little bit today about what Weaver mentioned at the beginning, the idea of new coalitions forming in the wake of 2016 and onward. I would say the only common language I've seen effectively challenge some of these issues is the language of consumerism. And, Netflix recently aired a show called Cuties, which was hyper-sexualizing children. And there was a consumer pushback, but I noticed there was a lot of flailing around in terms of coming to some common agreement about why people felt unsettled by that. So I want to focus on something that actually we did get out of the sexual revolution, not a good thing necessarily, but a very enduring thing, that if we are going to form new coalitions and craft new ways of challenging some of the excessive individualism that the sexual revolution begat, we have to confront. And that is a phrase that was coined in 1968 by a feminist that has stayed with us, morphing into all kinds of other activist movements. And that's the personal is political. Second wave feminism embraced this as a rallying cry. The civil rights movement in some ways embraced this as a rallying cry. It began, as so many culture wars does, on college campuses with student activists, grew out of consciousness raising sessions that feminists had. And it was embraced because, for a number of reasons, the really, really forceful thing it does that I think is also very pernicious is elevate individual lived experience and feelings as indisputable proof of the righteousness of a cause, right? So I think you can trace this from the 60s and the consciousness raising and women's tales of their experience, some of which were actually horrible and which did lead to some legal protections that were needed and that I certainly wouldn't argue against. But this idea of the personal is political, my lived experience trumps anything else that anyone else, might present to me, such as evidence, such as facts. This is righteous because it's my experience. I think we see that now in the safetyism culture that pervades a lot of our contemporary debates about free speech, about liberalism. And in a way, it has also given us, strangely, since it grew out of the kind of hyper-individualistic sexual revolution of the 1960s, what it has reached full flower to become is a sort of neo-Maoist ideological conformity where certain things, if someone invokes their personal experience, are not allowed to be challenged, are not allowed to be discussed. And you see this, its final form in the kind of intersectional feminism that now dominates the cultural left and certainly the college campuses. All of that began with the 1960s feminist claim that the personal was political. Very powerful message. It did a lot of good, but I would argue it probably did more harm than good. So I think one of the things that would be interesting and to discuss today is that if we're thinking about new coalitions, we should also remember just how factionalist and riven the feminist movement always has been over all kinds of issues about pornography, about consent, about motherhood, marriage. And I think younger generations are raising these issues again in an interesting way, but lack a vocabulary for really talking about the seriousness of them. So I think you get discussions of is prostitution sex work? And if I have an OnlyFans account, I'm a feminist because I'm making money off of my own body. So it all gets crafted in a particular way, but in fact, these are serious questions about commodifying oneself. Is that actually empowerment or is it oppression? Is pornography something that can be good for women and good for society, or is it in fact corrosive of the kinds of values that we should be promoting? So what it all comes down to is, I think, if you come from the conservative side of this argument, which I do, to counter this idea that the personal must always be political, we have to develop an argument that talks about our commonalities, our common humanity. And for that, we have to talk about dignity. And dignity doesn't care about your sex. Dignity is something that we all share and we should all give to each other. So if we're going to talk about that, forming new coalitions, we have to talk about the kinds of values that we all share. And I don't think that the personal is political is a way to build bridges in that future, because as we've seen from the fallout of the sexual revolution, it's been very divisive and created more factions than unity. So I'll leave it to Mary to.
Thank you. Ms. Eberstadt, please.
Thank you. Well, first I'd like to say thanks to Weaver and all the Buckley Fellows for hosting this discussion in the first place. I've spent some of my written work on the sexual revolution and its fallout, and I can tell you that not very long ago, just to raise the subject was to get laughed at in all the best places. So it's really encouraging to see this kind of openness. I have been determined for a long time to put the record of the sexual revolution out there, because I think that it has been widely misinterpreted to the detriment of our society and our country. And my conviction is that the empirical record shows those claims to be true. So again, it's wonderful to have a forum where we can all jump in and add to that record. I would like to focus opening discussion on just 3 points. And these are 3 paradoxes of the sexual revolution and its actual fallout. Paradox 1, and I agree with Chris Caldwell here, I think what kicks the revolution into gear is the birth control pill, the technological shock of the birth control pill. So if the foundation of the sexual revolution was supposed to be cheap, reliable contraception, then how did it happen that out of wedlock births and abortions and marital breakup all rose sharply in the wake of the birth control pill? That's a big question, because to go back in time, as Helen would say, we can see that people like Margaret Sanger, for example, justified a widespread contraception partly because she said it would strengthen marriages and it would reduce abortion, which she claimed to think was a horrible thing. So why, despite those claims, did the opposite occur? And the answer there is very, very interesting and requires more footnotes than we have room for. But the answer has been given not by theologians or conservatives particularly, but by perfectly secular social scientists and economists. And in one seminal paper published by George Akerlof, Janet Yellen, and Michael Katz in 1996, they argued that what made these social pathologies increase in tandem after the birth control pill was that essentially the birth control pill relieved men of the need to take responsibility. It erased the possibility of a shotgun marriage. And since then, there's been other scholarship, also from perfectly secular sources, demonstrating the same thing. So that is one central paradox of the sexual revolution that remains terribly important and demands to be understood. A second paradox: the sexual revolution, we have heard from generations of feminists now, was supposed to liberate women. It was supposed to make them happier. So why is it that instead it made the 2 things that women even now say they want most, family and husband, harder to get? Now, why do I say that? Did the sexual revolution make those things harder to get? Well, if you look at survey data on female happiness, not only in the United States, but across the Western world, it looks like female happiness has been declining over the course of the years since the sexual revolution. Male happiness, interestingly, has remained pretty steady. So why are women reporting themselves to be less happy? In effect, the revolution made it harder to get what they wanted by flooding the sexual marketplace with available potential partners. The revolution made it harder for any individual man and woman, especially for men, to say, I will commit myself to you for the rest of our lives and to our children as well. It also sidelined men in a really interesting way. A sociologist named Lionel Tiger understood this over 20 years ago. He wrote a brilliant book called The Decline of Males, in which he argued that by taking all reproductive decisions out of joint hands and leaving them just to the woman, whether this was contraception or abortion. In effect, men were rendered useless from the reproductive point of view. So it's a very interesting study. Another indication that women are less happy is, of course, the Me Too movement. In my latest book, Primal Screams, I have a chapter about this because I think the Me Too movement is a fascinating example of unintended consequences, and especially consequences of the revolution. At one point, I sat down for several hours, and I hope it's time off purgatory, reading through these individual accounts by women who came forward during Me Too, and then reading some of the men's accounts. And regardless of the he said, she said problem, one thing is very clear. It is that for all of the sexual literacy of today's people, they are sexually illiterate when it comes to understanding the opposite sex. In story after story of Me Too, what you get are completely different Rashomon-like accounts of what transpired between two people. And this has led me to conclude that part of the revolution's fallout, the shrinkage of the family breakup, et cetera, has meant that people know less about the opposite sex, paradoxically enough, than they used to, because they used to have examples before them called fathers, brothers, cousins, extended family, uncles, aunts, sisters, and the rest. And demographically, the likelihood of being able to learn from all these related people is much lower than it used to be, because many of us have fewer people like that in our lives. And of course, family breakup further reduces the sheer numbers game out there. So these are all parts of the paradox that what was supposed to liberate women instead seems to have delivered some of the opposite goods. The third paradox that I would like us to think about is that the sexual revolution was supposed to be a transformation of private interchanges, right? It was just supposed to be something that made relations between any two given consenting people easier. It was supposed to be private, and it is still presented as something that is private, off limits for public discussion. And the paradox here is that this ostensibly private revolution, in fact, has had massive public consequences. And to tick off just a few of them. Demographically, as already mentioned, the revolution led to smaller families, more splintered families, families in which children were less likely to have a sibling, including a sibling of the opposite sex. The demographic fallout also led to political fallout. In Primal Screams, I argue that this movement that we see on the far left and the far right toward identitarian political groups is being driven by what is fundamentally a Western identity crisis. It's been brought on by the fact that people are no longer able to construct identities as all of the human beings before us did, including the illiterate ones. Those people knew who they were. They situated themselves relationally in a family. I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm an aunt, and so on. Many people, especially younger people, don't have recourse to answers like those, are not coming from robust kinship situations where they can answer their questions of identity by resort to the people they are related to. And this, I think, has thrown many of them into crisis. And I think we've also seen this on the streets of the United States this year, where many disconnected young people have been protesting, rioting, and doing so with such irrationalism in many cases that it is clear something primordial is going on. These are not political protests as civilized societies understand political protests. So that's another kind of fallout that I think has seeped way down in this subterranean way and influenced people, especially younger people, at a very elemental level. And there is also, of course, fiscal fallout. essentially the welfare state across the West operates as a substitute father. And how tenable this is a subject raised constantly across Europe, as Chris Caldwell knows. There is fiscal pressure on the welfare state because of the shrinking tax base on which it depends. And so that's another kind of macro consequence of something that was supposed to be just between two people in the first place. And finally, in addition to the social fallout that I already mentioned, there's a kind of fallout on the divisiveness of our politics because of our refusal to engage responsibly with this subject of the sexual revolution and what it has done to us. So back when all of this started, and maybe we can even give Margaret Sanger a pass on this, assuming she spoke in good faith about that one subject, it kind of made sense that people would think good things would come of this, and that it would be an antidote to certain social ills. But after 60 years of empiricism, we who live in the here and now can't make that case. We have to admit that we know these things and move on from there, including politically. So thanks again, Weaver and Buckley Fellows.
Thank you so much. So I'll move quickly to some questions from myself, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So if you're an attendee, just a reminder, you can submit questions through the Q&A feature. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. So first I'll ask, and I'll direct this at Mr. Caldwell, but all of the panelists are welcome to respond. I'll ask, what role did the civil rights movement and the related legislation and the growth of the federal government play in the sexual revolution, the growth of a counterculture, so on and so forth?
Well, I would say not very much. I think the civil rights movement is part of what we'd call the pure political strand of the 1960s, unless you talk about sex, you know, in the way that Betty Friedan did in The Feminine Mystique in the early 60s. When she talks about a woman's sex life, she means everything that involves her being a woman. Motherhood is part of a woman's sex life, and the jobs to which she's limited are part of the sexual aspect of her life. If you look at it that way, then you can say that the women's movement, when it really gathered steam, started to model itself on the civil rights movement. I think that the civil rights, well, let's just say the Civil Rights Act, I think is the most important thing in the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act provided people who were discriminated against with an alternative way of ending discrimination besides passing new laws. Basically, the federal government despaired of getting southern states to pass laws to eliminate segregation. And so it created ways to force integration through lawsuits, through regulation, through withholding of funds. The transformation that I describe in my book is the generalization of that model to the point where it becomes a second way of doing politics. And I would say that when women began to wish to enter the workplace, to rise to more higher executive positions, and to gain admission to places from which they had been barred, like, for instance, men's clubs. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a model they used. They were able to sue under the Civil Rights Act because sex was included in it. But as far as altering the actual sex part of sex, I don't see that it had a role.
If I can add something about the Civil Rights Act and the sexual revolution. When we talk about the sexual revolution and the revolution in gender relations, I think one aspect that's underappreciated is the total disappearance of single-sex spaces. I mean, if you think about our time traveler, an adult male in 1950 going about his day is going to have a lot of things in his life that are all male. He might belong to an all male social club, or be a Rotarian, or a Mason, or a Knight of Columbus. There are just lots of social spaces, the Boy Scouts, that are all male. And those completely disappear almost entirely due to lawsuits in the 1970s and 80s. To take an example from New Haven, shortly after coeducation came in, the first thing that all of the women who came to Yale did was start filing lawsuits against all of the institutions in New Haven, because they quickly realized that it was not enough to have the formal position of female Yale undergraduate or female Yale professor, because a lot of the things that allowed a professor to advance in her career were taking place in informal spaces, which is why they sued Morey's to force them to admit women as members, which Morey's did only under the threat of a lawsuit in 1974. And you might think that that's quite nice because that's empowering to women, but the more you read about these lawsuits that just eliminated all single-sex spaces, the more likely you are to find one that makes you kind of sad, right? Like the old man in California who, as a charitable bequest in his will, endowed a boys' club for delinquent boys. And then it was destroyed by a lawsuit from a girl who said that you have to admit girls to your boys' club, even though that was contrary to the donor's intent. And in every society in history, from America to Maasai tribesmen, the rituals of adulthood and maturity have almost all taken place in sex-exclusive ways. Men teach boys how to become men, and women teach girls how to become women. So if we see a decline in maturity, and boys kind of failing to act like men, and gender relations kind of going off the rails, one of the reasons might be that all of these really vitally important all male and all female spaces that used to be such an important part of culture were killed by lawsuits. And that was the fault of civil rights law.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to jump in? If not, I'll ask this. I'll open it to any panelist. So a lot of conservative commentators, notably Tucker Carlson, see a lot of promise in a revival of an economically nationalist and socially conservative majority in this country. And relatedly, they see, some have noted that younger generations are, more socially conservative, or at least more amenable to illiberal ideas than perhaps the boomers. So do any of you think this is real, or is this optimistic thinking on the part of folks on the right? Mary, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so following on something that Helen was just saying, I mean, I think it is unlikely that the Zoomers and the millennials can turn overnight into social conservatives because they have not had, in many cases, a model before them for that. In my own work, I draw often from animal science. And one of the interesting things about animal science is that more and more scientists understand that animals learn by watching others of their kind, and in particular by watching their siblings and their parents. Animals are intensely familial in a way that wasn't even understood 10 years ago. So that would seem to indicate that in the absence of leadership that's familial, or say within organized religion, young people today have a longer way to go to get to social conservatism. On the other hand, I don't think we need a socially conservative majority. All we need is a majority that understands that the state needs to throw more of its muscle behind family formation and making things easier for people to have kids and things like that. And I think that you could get majority sentiment for, including from younger people, because they know exactly how broken things are out there, and that gives us something to work with.
Well, and if I may just add one other thought to that, it's such an important point. If you look at what the elite class says, about sexual liberation, the need, we don't need these families, welfare will take care of the people who fall through the cracks, it's all fine. If you look at what they say, it doesn't match what they do. The upper middle and upper classes who are well educated have higher marriage rates, their families stay together, they invest in their children at rates that broken families are unable to do, and which, quite frankly, the state cannot make up that deficit for them. So there is a weird sort of irony in hearing cultural elite opinion tell people who could benefit from stronger families that actually they're very liberated in their fractured existence. So I totally agree. That's such a good point that Mary made.
Yeah, if I could mention these poll statistics on the illiberality of this generation of people, which they're very often torqued up in a way, so that the rises in fringe questions. There is an increase in the number of people who answer yes to questions like, is it sometimes necessary for a strong, leader to take control and run roughshod over certain institutions to get things done? You are getting some higher answers on that, but I don't think we should read that as betokening any diminished commitment to democracy among young people. It may just be a reflection of what they're seeing. So if you watched the demonstrations and riots this summer in the wake of the George Floyd killing, you would see an awful lot of people constrained to change pretty harmless things they had said in the course of the weeks after the events, like Drew Brees, for instance, the quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, who just said, I wouldn't kneel during the national anthem because I respect the flag too much. And he actually had to come out, and I don't know what kind of pressure was put on him, but he had to apologize on a video. I think that's an example of illiberalism. So when a young person is asked, is it necessary? It might not be a judgment on the desirability of such use of coercion. It might just be a judgment on how is society working normally. You see?
Thank you. So now here's a question that combines something I had with something from the audience. So how much is the decay the result of American civil religion, if I may call it that, mainline Protestantism, or as this audience member puts it, mainstream religion, which is rather bland and all-forgiving? Anyone may jump in.
So the religion is important here because the decline in the number of people who report regularly going to church should concern everyone, because churches are one of those non-state actors that do encourage stability and service and all of the virtues, if I may use such a throwback word, that we should be encouraging in each new generation. And but I will say this: I think that the challenge ahead is not getting people to go back to church in whatever faith they practice, but combating what's become a secular faith, which is far more appealing because the barrier to entry is so low. You don't have to profess anything but being awake to all of the supposed oppressions around you. You can fight a battle. You don't even have to attend a service every week or tithe. You can sit at your computer and feel like a warrior. As we saw this summer, there are plenty of people who will pour into the streets and become quite enraged about just about anything if they feel it's oppressive. So I think there's a secular faith at work here that argues that's extremely appealing to young people and is extraordinarily appealing to a nation that's been on lockdown for months and months with very few outlets like, organized sports or school or any of the other things we usually can get this out on. And that's the faith actually that I worry about, because paired with a decline in the quality and quantity of civics education in this country, it becomes very difficult to say, yes, if you have a problem or if there's a conflict in our democracy, we have ways of dealing with it. And here are some of the ways you can change the law, you can vote, you can organize, a pressure group and lobby a legislature. There are formalized tracks and even informal tracks and ways of doing this. And to go back to the civil rights era, a lot of the kids on the streets today who feel that they're just like the civil rights actors, it's astonishing if you look at the kind of discipline and organization that was practiced by civil rights activists in the 60s. It is nothing like a lot of our keyboard warriors today. So I think if we're going to talk about faith, we have to talk about how we combat this secular religion that's kind of taken hold of the country, that developed first on campus and has spread.
And to add something specifically to the part of the question about the mainline churches having become bland, I do think blandness of the churches is a huge part of the problem. Not because the churches aren't, teaching young people that fornication will lead to hellfire, but because blandness in any organization or institution always leads to revolution in the next generation, because it deprives the young people of a sense of belonging. Because when your institution is bland, there's kind of no difference between people who belong to it and people who don't. So you don't get that sense of belonging. And that is in many ways a lot like the situation that gave rise to the 1960s. One fun fact about the late 60s student revolutions is that you saw it in every country in the Western world. Which kind of makes you think that the student unrest wasn't related to any particular political problem that they happened to latch onto, whether it was nuclear power in Germany or the war in the United States, but that there was something kind of sociological happening across Western civilization that was common to all countries. And the one complaint that shows up in every single country among the student revolutionaries is revolt against the blandness of their upbringing. They say, oh, we hate suburbia. We hate this boring, white collar world that we were raised in. We want something more meaningful. And so, in some ways they had a point. The 1950s were a particularly bland time, but that should lead us to reflect on the dangers of having too bland a culture, because it's going to lead to young people who lack a sense of belonging and therefore feel a need to lash out. And that's true whether it's churches or suburbia or anything else.
I'd like to address something that Christine brought up about the woke culture and the tendency of woke people to identify themselves with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I think I disagree with Christine. I think that they are in a direct line to the civil rights of the 1960s, and it's at several removes, at several stages of difference. But I think that we need to face that the new religion, that the new secular religion that we're talking about is civil rights. And I think that if you look at the way the idea of civil rights has been transformed, originally you have the idea of civil rights is that you can use lawsuits and you can use regulation to penetrate into institutions and companies to make them change the way they do business, to force them to hire first Black people, then women, then Hispanics, then people of immigrant background, then gays, etc. Okay, so you can enter the company, but you get to a second stage, which is when you get to the Griggs case in 1971, which is a Supreme Court decision that bans neutral examinations for hiring. Griggs was a case in which it was granted by the court that this was a very useful examination, but the company was not allowed to give it because it was said to constitute a headwind against Black applicants. Well, what that meant was a change in what let's say bigotry was. You could be found guilty of bigotry in a court without doing anything explicitly bigoted. Then as the 70s and 80s moved on, particularly when you got into the early 90s with the Bush Civil Rights Act of 1991, when it became possible to sue companies for damages and for pain and suffering, then you started to get damages for harassment, hostile environment. You could be sued, it was not just if you had like a grabby employee who sort of like went after interns. If a guy kept a copy of Playboy magazine on his desk, suddenly you were liable to be sued for misconduct. And so that's a form of expression. So suddenly there became some behaviors that were just expressively wrong, right? And then, so you wind up with a situation in which it becomes very difficult to express, let's say, non-progressive ideas about anything touching race or sex or sexuality. And at the end of the day, a university or a newspaper or another media outlet is not really different than other corporations in the legal strictures that they find themselves under. So you basically have an environment in which it's just not permitted in any major institution, in any institution of significance, to speak your mind about this sort of thing.
Thank you.
So going back to the original question, Weaver, I think there are interesting discussions to be had about the founding and whether it was flawed, and about the implosion of mainline Protestantism and lots of other things. But I don't think that those can be credited or discredited with the sexual revolution. And the reason is that every society that embraced the revolution has exhibited the same sorts of trends: rising abortions, family breakup, looked at in the big picture. This is pretty much the same across the West. And it's why the example of Hungary, which has tried to start a kind of family counter-revolution with some of its policies, is one that I think we all should pay attention to. The effort to, for instance, tie student debt to family formation, to make it easier to forgive student debt if people are married. It's a very interesting, small r revolutionary sort of thinking. And, I think those are the lines that we ought to be looking at when we think about building social conservatism in the future.
Thank you. So again, I'll try and combine a couple questions here. I'll direct it again at you, Ms. Eberstadt. You've written on the pill. A lot of conservatives often malign the pill as the first cause of the sexual revolution. It's an easy boogeyman to point to. How accurate is that? And secondly, I'll try and weave this in. Would it be safe to look at other cultures, kind of going off a point Ms. Andrews made earlier, other cultures that have sex-specific education for sex-specific child rearing? Can we make cross-cultural comparisons to sort of get us out of the cyclical arguments that we make time and time again? The right talking about the cost of the sexual revolution from the pill, the left talking about the benefits.
Sure, I think cross-cultural comparisons are all to the good. And there's a lot of literature on sex-specific education, single-sex education being more efficacious, generally speaking, than putting boys and girls together at certain ages. Yeah, that all makes sense. As for the pill being a bogeyman, the problem is, and this is a problem that pro-lifers especially have to wrestle with, is that when you really look at the numbers and when you look at what has happened since the 1960s, it is clear that no pill, no abortion as we now know it. In other words, rates of abortion skyrocketed, not in defiance of the pill, but because of it and because of what it did to human relationships. And I know that's a hard truth to have sink in, but in a free-thinking forum like this, I think it's one that we ought to wrestle with.
On the subject of cross-cultural comparisons, I'd actually like to throw some cold water on that idea, because I'm looking at the question, and I think it's possible that the particular kind of learning from other cultures that the questioner has in mind may be something that David Brooks proposed recently in a really long article for the New York Times, where he said, you know, that our model of the nuclear family has been broken by progressivism. You know, mom, dad, 2 kids in one suburban household. That's just not the model anymore. But that doesn't necessarily have to be a catastrophe for conservatism, says David Brooks, because we can just kind of shift to a model of, you know, like peasants and big extended families, where your family is multi-generational and has aunts and uncles hanging around. And that is an interesting idea. And I can see why somebody with as inventive a mind as David Brooks latched onto it, because there's something there. But I think in practice, any attempt to have cross-cultural learning from other cultures that have these big, sprawling extended family models, any attempt to import that now, given the dysfunction in the current American family, is just going to lead to a worst of both worlds situation. So I think that's a clever and interesting idea, but I don't think it will work in practice. I don't have a lot of hope for it.
Well, it also relies on a division of labor that's built on tradition, where you have, you know, aunts who are doing the washing and another aunt who's taking care of the children while, you know, the mother is cooking and that kind of thing. And we actually don't for a couple of generations, we have not had enough people born to provide everyone with aunts and uncles in quite that way. But we also don't have that a division of labor that's articulated in quite that way.
Thank you. So another question from the audience here. What have the Mormons and Orthodox Jewish communities figured out in being able to preserve their cultures, preserve traditional forms of the family and traditional hierarchies that, you know, regular Americans, mainline Protestants, even American Catholics have not been able to figure out? Is it just a question of theology, or is there something more to it?
It's the opt-out, right? Our friend Rod Dreher has written about this in his book, The Benedict Option, as well. And it has very little to do with the details of one's theology and altogether to do with the amount of discipline one is willing to subject oneself to and to build a community. And I took issue with Rod's book when it first came out, because I felt like he was assuming that the children raised in that environment would automatically see its benefits rather than rebel at some point. I was raised fundamentalist, so I have like a lot of skin in this game. But I think that his larger point, and particularly now that we're quite a few years ahead and into much more turmoil, is really compelling, because I think rather than trying to import from other countries, or rather than even relying on the state to do this for people, communities that form with a common purpose and opt out of some of the demands that society places on families in particular, on how families should be structured, because not all these communities, I think secular people who don't have any experience of faith look at an Orthodox Jewish community or Mormon community and they say, oh, those women must be so oppressed. Or they've seen, you know, Big Love on cable and think, oh, all these women are like sister wives. That's not actually how it works. There's actually a lot of empowerment among women in some of these communities in terms of their choices and the power they exercise in the community. But if that would be one sort of sliver of optimism in the future, is people choosing to form these communities based around a common sense of value and purpose and how to raise kids. You know, there are horror stories of this too. You know, some of the kibbutzes went off the rails. You know, there are always people who leave the Mormonism and other faiths and complain about the strictures. But it's a fascinating idea that I think a younger generation should explore. It's a lot more interesting than, you know, van life on Instagram, right? Where people just take a couple of years and drive around in a convertible van and post beautiful gauzy photos on Instagram. It's hard work though. This is the thing. It's not an Instagrammable lifestyle. You have to show up day in, day out, practice the rituals. You have to be part of a community. It's a very challenging thing, but it's a challenge I think more and more people might be willing to explore if Rod's correct.
Yeah, I think it's not so much that the Mormons and the Orthodox Jews figured something out as that there was something they didn't forget. And what they didn't forget was very simple. Babies are good. Contrary to the dominant storyline, babies are good. A pregnancy is not a catastrophe. This is a deep wisdom that even though the Catholic Church officially teaches it, I think many, maybe even most Catholics don't believe that this is a fundament of wisdom. Babies are good. And it is interesting that the Mormons and the Orthodox Jews, the two examples given, are also faiths that theologically proscribe contraception. They are not absolutist about it, as the Catholic Church is, at least in theory, but it is severely circumscribed because babies are good.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question, I'll borrow Ross Douthat's recent thesis in his book on decadence, in which he essentially argues that every recent generation has copied the baby boomers in one way or another and repeated cultural and political and social phenomenon of the past. How accurate is this? Or is there something that he got wrong in this book?
Nobody wants to criticize Ross, but come on, Helen, that's right up your alley.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being in high school and thinking it was really, really weird that the super hip stoner kids behind the, smoking pot behind the gym had on their jackets and bags patches of Black Sabbath and Pink Floyd. And I remember thinking, you don't want to go for something more contemporary? If you're rebelling against your parents, why are you listening to their bands? But I think there's something to that thesis that we're all caught in an eternal cycle. And gosh, we even saw that this year, right? We've been taught, my generation, the millennials, to hate all of American history. But the one part of American history that we're allowed to like is the 60s and the 60s rebellion. So naturally, that's the one that we're reenacting. We're going out into the streets. But I think Ross is going to be surprised because all of I think society is a lot less resilient than it was when the boomers acted out. So it may not be able to survive our imitation of the boomer rebellion in the same way that it survived boomer rebellion. Because when the boomers acted out, there was enough ballast in political stability. There was enough of a silent majority that they could elect Richard Nixon, and the country was prosperous, so they could all, get their 20s out of their systems, and then go get prosperous jobs and move to the suburbs, these former Weather Underground kids. That's not the way it is for the millennials. We're going to act out and join Antifa, and then fall down the ladder into the gig economy. There is no longer a silent majority. A majority of Americans polled think that Black Lives Matter is super great. And they approve of the protests. So yeah, we have been caught in decadence and replaying the boomer reel over and over, but I think we may be reaching the end of the line on that because society is less resilient, and that's not really a good thing.
And I will give one shout out to Ross's cynicism, because he, like me, is Gen X, and we're like the forgotten generation. And so we just sit around and point out everybody else's mistakes because we're this small generation that's very cynical. But Helen makes an excellent point, because a lot of what drives the anger and the search for this secular faith and a kind of sense of purpose and identity, with which I think sexual identity questions have played a big role in recent years as well, is a sense that the system doesn't work for younger generations, and the promises made to young people today by their parents haven't panned out. And we see that with student debt, we see that with jobs, we see that with just the general sense of instability. So I agree with Ross's concerns about decadence, but I think Helen's right that dealing with this issue of instability and how it drives people to embrace certain identities, including radical ones, is the question for the future.
Excellent, thank you. So a couple members of the audience have asked, what is the way out of this problem? And I'll add to that, can the government engineer a solution as through pro-natalist policies, through tightening divorce laws, through benefits to working class communities, or is it a cultural one through institutions like academia, American religion, so on and so forth? I'll ask Mr. Caldwell first.
Well, I've already said, I believe that there are certain traditional attitudes, and the Bostock decision this summer has extended that coverage to matters of transsexuality. Even there are certain traditional attitudes that are pretty much, I don't even mean pretty much, that are essentially banned from major institutions in the country. And so until there is a drawback in the use of civil rights law to legislate, let's say, moral attitudes, moral and religious attitudes, I think that there is very little prospect of those attitudes changing.
So I don't think it's an either or. Obviously, the problem is both cultural and political, and so it should be addressed in both realms. Politically, as I've mentioned, I think that it's a great time for some grassroots experiments. I know pro-natalist policies historically don't work very well. Interesting to see if that can be tweaked and made to work. Again, things like encouraging family formation, tying that to student debt, which I think is the most crushing problem that most young people face right now. These are all things that the government can do. These are things that states might be able to do. So politically, these things can be addressed. Culturally, I would point to a couple of encouraging things. One is that, there is already a counter revolution underway. There has been an explosion of groups, including on campuses, that are sort of on the side of traditionalism in a way that didn't exist when I was in college, when Chris was in college. I have in mind things like the Fellowship of Catholic University Students that's on over 100 campuses, the Thomistic Circles, which is, I think, now on every Ivy League campus, the Love and Fidelity Network. We need to understand that stuff like this wasn't around before, and it has arisen out of the kind of brokenness that we're describing, and that's all to the good. That's signs of a vibrant counterculture. Those are signs of a vibrant counterculture. And finally, I want to put the thought out there that Eric Kaufman, a demographer in England, wrote in a book called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And he has a very interesting discussion of demography. It is an iron law of demography that secular people have few to no children. And why this is so might be a mystery, certainly worth thinking about. But religious people have children, and the more religious they are, the more children they have. So his speculation is that the world of the future is a more polarized world, because its two main subsets see the world very differently, but that over time, just as a matter of a numbers game, the religious will overtake the non-religious. Interesting thought.
I'll chime in to add to that and say, I think another, I believe politics a little bit more downstream from culture, and the concerns particularly about free speech and free thought, which I agree with Chris, some of the surveys that have shown, pretty draconian ideas about free speech among younger generations are probably not as shocking as we think they are, but they are nevertheless still shocking to some of us who came of age, assuming everybody, of course, free speech, what's wrong? And the idea of safe spaces and trigger warnings. I mean, conservatives mock these things, but we should listen to what they're telling us about what the younger generation says it needs, and answer that need rather than simply mocking the things that we think won't work for them. And one of the things I think needs to be created, and I agree with Mary that we're starting to see a lot of promising ways that young people are doing this, is to craft a culture of liberalism that listens and debates and isn't using the language of emotion and feeling so much as it's using the language of common values, dignity, and persuasion. Because those are very different things, right? And I can yell and scream at you about how I feel, but that likely wouldn't be persuasive. You might try to persuade me by listening to the feelings and then countering them with some facts and maybe sharing. I mean, there's a way to do this. We've been doing it for a very long time as a pluralistic democracy. I don't think it's helped by the acceleration of social media and cable news and all these trends we're all familiar with. There are ways, though, to use those tools in more effective sense, particularly to reach out to younger people. So I'm somewhat optimistic, but it actually has to come from the younger generations themselves. They have to recognize the value of liberal debate and persuasion, and they have to fight back against the illiberal trends, particularly on campus, from the very beginning. When they see it, the see something, say something. I feel like that actually should be the free speech mantra for the younger generation.
All right, thank you. So one question that gets at a few points that audience members have made is, are conservatives bad at creating an elite? That is, have liberals and folks at the left done a good job of marrying within institutions like the university within their class, while as conservatives, especially in this populist moment, have decided that they are not the movement of the top, the movement of the American elite, and this has harmed the conservatives' ability to spread its ideas through society?
I don't I don't think it's a matter of deciding anything. You don't get to decide to be an elite. No, I mean, the people who were sort of like going into the mines in South Wales in the 19th century didn't sort of like say, you know what, I think instead of doing this, I think we ought to run the House of Lords, I think in the same way, the people who are, stuck shopping at the dollar store and they're suffering with, like opioid addiction in Eastern Ohio are not, they can't just go get a job at Google. I think that the terms left and right are very, very counterproductive now. I mean, look, back when the terms were created in the French Revolution, the right meant order, it meant religion, it meant hierarchy, it meant privilege, it meant possession of property, land, and the means of production. Okay, now, right now, you'd say if there was a party that represented those interests in the United States, it would be the Democratic Party. You know what I mean? It's really, the right and the left stuff is not that interesting. I think that basically the parties have two different class interests. The Democrats are the parties of the Democrats are the party of the participants in the global economy. And that means the people at the very highest, the people who run Google, and the people at the very lowest. That is, the people who just came across the border from Mexico and are going to work in the service economy in the same city where Google has its offices. The Republican Party is the party of the people who are, for some reason, shut out of that, and so they have very different interests. But the Republican Party is just not an elite party now, and it's a liability that they have. There have been other successful non-elite parties, but I don't see any possibility of changing that through a conscious resolution.
So I see this question, the creation of an effective conservative elite, as largely a question for philanthropists. If you want to talk about how to raise up tradition-minded people, you look first to the schools, which is why it's encouraging that there's been serious growth in these classical academies for K through 8 students. That's something that philanthropists should be paying close attention to. Kids who grow up learning Latin and Greek and have a classical foundation, I think, are a lot less likely to get pulled into the darker corners of the internet or you know, the shattered social life out there. And philanthropy is also in order to create an alternative universe. This is something that Michael Novak, among other people, understood very well. He said, we don't, since we're shut out of getting their prizes, we need to create our own prizes. One of his last thoughts in life was to create a Flannery O'Connor Prize to reward short story writing, for example. And, you know, to some extent you see this with the Bradley Prizes, for example. If conservatives are going to be shut out of MacArthur's and Pulitzer's and everything else that they're shut out of, the Bradley Prizes are a kind of encouraging step. But we need more of that, and we need it for students also. Of course, Claremont has some good offerings that way with fellowships, but we need people of vision who don't want to put their names on buildings as much as they want to fund institutions that will ameliorate some of the problem out there that Chris has described so well.
Thank you. One final question, perhaps we might run out of time, is going back to the 60s itself. What role did the Vietnam War play in the rise of the sexual revolution? And relatedly, could the protracted conflicts in the Middle East play a similar role for Zoomers today?
Well, there's no draft. So that I was just going to say, I mean, the big difference there in terms of the imprint on a generation is that, you know, we have not had a draft since Vietnam, and during Vietnam with the draft, I think there was a real mindset shift in a younger generation that faced death on the battlefield. But go ahead, Chris, you actually, this is.
No, I do think that, again, class is a big issue. The opposition to the Vietnam War was concentrated in elite universities. And actually, working class people did not have a way out of the Vietnam War. Then when we lost the Vietnam War, to have refused to serve became in some people's minds almost like a virtue. It became like a cool thing. And that created a sort of a subterranean culture war. And that is why, to take something that happened 30 years ago before you kids were born, the election of Bill Clinton, who spent the 1960s, in grad school in Oxford and didn't go to Vietnam, the election of him as president after a period in which we'd had several decades in which every president had been a veteran of World War II, was a shock to a lot of people in Middle America. I think that it hardened a certain class conflict, and it influenced things that way. There's no such dynamic at work in our Middle Eastern wars today.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask a question that we sort of touched on earlier, but a number of audience members want to know about Hungary and Poland and other Eastern European nations pursuing policies aimed at boosting birth rates and building stronger families and limiting divorce. Ms. Eberstadt, you mentioned you don't find these to be historically effective. Do any of the other panelists have thoughts on government approaches to natalism and family formation?
Well, I said that historically, generally speaking, pro-natalist policies haven't proven effective, but I think what Hungary is up to and what Poland is up to are a brand new set of experiments for a new generation, and I'm all for seeing what becomes of them.
I'm generally wary of government meddling too much in the family, but given that that's what it's been doing for several generations through welfare policy, I agree with Mary that it's time for some new thinking along that score. It is I know Social Security and entitlements are called the third rail, but this is a kind of third rail, right? Because you're talking about personal decisions that people make. You're talking about, you know, cultural attacks on what people perceive to be cultural things, and it involves race, it involves class, it involves education, all of the things that politicians actually like to talk about in vague terms to rally their voters, but actually really dislike making policy about, because once you get into the thick of it, it's rather difficult. I would like to see a new sort of report on the state of the family. We haven't had a really decent, you know, commission convened by the federal government filled with experts. I know we mock those here in Washington a lot as punting on things, but I think we need some really solid research that looks at the effects of welfare policy in this country, family policy in this country, and how the tax code is structured and how that has harmed families. That I would welcome. I get a little more libertarian, my libertarian knee starts to jerk when I start thinking of being much more targeted about people's marital decisions and whatnot.
Well, I think one country that had to deal with a cratering birth rate before Hungary and before us is Russia. Russia's birth rate just collapsed after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it has rebounded a little bit and stabilized. And in that case, it wasn't because of any government program. It was because they were no longer so depressed about their place in the world. You know, the collapse of the Russian birth rate was in many ways psychological. They just thought, what is even the point of our country anymore? We don't see the reason to go on. They lost their sense of mission and purpose. Whereas now they're more optimistic. So I think making it easier and cheaper to form a family is good, but also having some sense of cultural self-respect is also something that America is going to have to get back if we're going to feel like producing another generation is a thing that we're interested in.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you to our four wonderful panelists for joining us today and offering really incisive comments on these important issues. That takes us right up to 6 o'clock. And to all the audience members who joined, thank you for taking time out of your afternoon to be with us at the Buckley Program. At this point, everyone would break into a round of applause. Obviously, you can't really hear that in this day and age, but we're very grateful for you all being here today. So with that, I'll end the panel and wish everyone a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Weaver.